The public has a long-held fascination with detectives. Detectives see a side of life the average person is never exposed to. In this podcast series, I Catch Killers with Gary Jubelin, I will be interviewing real detectives, taking the audience into their world, a world that is rarely seen by the public. I spent 34 years as a cop. For 25 of those years I was catching killers. That's what I did for a living. I was a homicide detective. I'm no longer interviewing bad guys, instead I'm interviewing detectives. The guests I've selected are the cops I consider real detectives. Their business was catching bad guys, and they were prepared to go into a world where pressure, risk and sacrifice was the norm. These are their stories. We are fortunate today to have retired Detective Inspector Dennis O'Toole as our guest here on I Catch Killers. Dennis had a major influence on my career. He's a detective in every sense of the word. His career is defined by some amazing cases. You'll be in for a real treat. In part one of this podcast, Dennis is talking us through his involvement in the chase and dramatic capture of one of Australia's worst serial killers, John Wayne Glover, known as the Granny Killer. This is just one of many fascinating cases Dennis has worked on. If you hear reference to Barry or Kilo during part 1 or 2 of this podcast, we're talking about one of Dennis's former workmates, who is a great homicide detective in his own right. Barry chose to leave the cops to pursue a business career, which has been very successful at. To this day, they remain good mates, and Barry has Dennis helping him out with his business. The time is 10 a.m. I'm Gary Jubelin. Sitting opposite me is Dennis O'Toole. Dennis, for the purpose of voice identification, can you tell me your full name and your service history?
Well, my full name is Dennis John O'Toole, and just short of 35 years in the New South Wales Police.
And do you agree you're here of your own free will?
Oh, well, I'm not too sure about that, but...
Dennis, be nice.
Yes, if you say so, George, yes, I'm here. Yes.
You understand you're not under arrest at this stage?
At this stage, yes, well, we'll see how it progresses, as long as you're aware of when a caution should be administered.
I'll be running this interview, Dennis. Let me run this show, please. Now, one very, very important thing. You do give me permission to record this, don't you? In light of recent events. Could you say it loud and clear? Yes.
I wasn't aware that this was going to be recorded. But,
Dennis, I don't want to go down this. I don't want to go down this path.
No, I accept that it will be recorded.
Okay, can you just sign this form?
My permission? No, I'm not signing any form.
Okay, good to see you.
Good to see you too, Jibs.
It's been a while.
Yeah, well, you've aged well, I've got to say. Yeah.
Thank you.
Like the old bottle of wine.
Yeah. No, well, it's been a long time, but look, I really think it's a privilege sitting here talking to you. When I talk homicide detectives, there's a couple of people that come to mind, and some of the jobs that you've worked on that not just detectives know about it, but the public would know about. And we're talking the Granny Killers, which is, I think, shaped the way that we do homicides with John Glover and the ladies around the North Shore, 6 victims in total, I believe. You also worked on the murder of Victor Chang, the renowned heart surgeon. And another one that people may or may not be aware of that you worked on was the matter involving the Waters brothers, the famous boxing family, Cess Waters and his sons Dean. So they're the ones that the public know about. You've done a lot more. You spent a lot of time in homicide. So let's have a chat.
Oh, yeah, well, great. Well, when you mention those, all of those particular events, and you've got to realise too, of course, that it's not just one person. In any of those sort of major investigations, or in fact any criminal investigation, it's not just one individual. You're part of a team, and that's something that, you know, I think everybody should be aware of. One individual might carry out a role, but there's so many roles, and everybody has got their own role to play. So
that's a good point. It's a point I don't think the public see. Like you'll see the figurehead of an investigation, but what goes behind the investigations, I think the public don't fully appreciate. Like when you look at it, not just the team members, the other detectives that are working on it, but the analysts and all sorts of people, the scientists, the forensic scientists that help.
That's right. And one of the big things, of course, is during any investigation, certainly major investigation, one of the big things is somebody normally appears in front of the cameras and is the public face, not necessarily all of the people doing the hard yards up at the coalface. They're all working behind the scenes, but they don't get the acknowledgement that perhaps they should.
Yeah.
Because you're only seeing the one person who is normally the senior person in charge. And that's how it should be.
Well, I liken detective training, and I was fortunate to work under, and I call him my mentor, was Paul Jacob, who I know you trained and worked with, and it is like an apprenticeship, isn't it? And there's a pecking order.
There's no doubt. Of course, Paul Jacob, he was a problem. We had to spend a bit of time and work very hard on him.
It's amazing how you turned him into a detective. He had nothing to start with.
No, he's like, if you've got an example of, a detective, in particular a homicide detective, I think you couldn't go past Jaco as the prime example of someone who's dedicated and loyal and believes, like most of us, certainly that went to homicide or detectives in general, believe in what they're doing.
Yeah.
And Jaco, we worked together for a number of years, and I can say we didn't at any stage have an agreement. We've never had crosswords. Got on very well together, and it was just so much of a pleasure to work with Jaco.
It's pretty amazing, because the intensity when you are working investigations, I think what the public don't understand is, like for New South Wales homicide, we cover the whole state of New South Wales, so you're literally a phone call away from jumping in a car or a plane and disappearing for months, and living and working with the people on your team.
Yeah, well, of course. And when the homicide, we were at North Region Homicide, which basically went from Kirribilli to Tweed Heads and inland. And you're on the go the whole time. The number of murders that you respond to, I can honestly say that I've probably forgotten them, not belittling any of that, but you're just going from one job to another, and it certainly takes its toll in a lot of cases on families, on their family life, because you don't see your family.
Yeah.
You're on call. But the bottom line is that you do believe in what you're doing. That's the thing with the unfortunate part about detectives. There's no glamour in it, as I see it. You've got the offender, and you want to bring them to justice, but there's so many victims, not just the one victim that may have been murdered or raped or abducted or whatever. It's the impact that it has on all those the families connected with the victims.
There is a ripple effect, isn't it? You have the one victim, but the amount of lives that it impacts on.
It's amazing, and it'd be good to say that we shouldn't have. We don't have a homicide, or it'd be best if we didn't. But the bottom line again, a fact is that there are some bad dudes out there, and it's going to happen.
It's going to happen, and they need people to lock them up. And I think a detective, homicide detective, and it doesn't just have to be homicide in any crime. When victims have come to you and you're the detective, I feel a sense of responsibility that you're responsible for bringing justice. With homicide, the stakes are very, very high. You touched on Paul Jacobs, some qualities, and certainly that's a quality that I've seen in you throughout your career, is that you're passionate about the work that you do.
Yeah, well, I think any homicide detective, to be honest, any detective, not everybody, of course, but the majority of detectives do believe in what they're doing. They believe that they have an obligation to keep the streets safe, keep their families safe, and other law-abiding people. These are decent people who obey the law through no fault of their own, find themselves in these incredible situations that they have to cope with for the rest of their lives. And I think you've got to be aware of that, not only the offender, but also the victims.
Yeah.
And in homicide particularly, you do spend a lot of time with victims, or we certainly did in my era. I don't know now, I've been retired for a while.
It's something that I'd like to think is still done, but I think sometimes it's lost, the importance of the rapport that you've got to build with the victim. Not the empathy, which is obviously has to come into play, but also the information you get through victims trusting you. Like if you're someone they trust, and I think people sometimes misunderstand what that link is with the victim. I know you have been one that certainly have kept in contact with families and offenders' families as well, not just the victims' families.
Yes, it's, when you look back at it, I think some people, when you tell them that, they think that's a little bit strange, but it just goes with the job, I suppose. It's very difficult to explain, really, but to get the trust of the family, and bearing in mind that in quite often these cases, that a member of the family may be the prime suspect.
Yeah,
so you have to tread very warily where you're sympathising and sympathetic to the family and what have you, but somebody might be the suspect.
It takes a strong moral compass there, doesn't it? I've been confronted with that, where you're dealing with the grieving relative, and whilst you're literally cuddling that grieving, crying relative, you're looking at the person thinking, is this the person that's arranged this, or is this the person that's done that?
Yes. There's been a number of instances where a member of the family will come out and appear on television and appeal and be very teary and what have you. And if you're there, after a period of time, experience, I think, does teach you, hello, there's something not right
well,
here.
Well, the old saying, crocodile tears.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, and that does happen, as you know. So.
Do you find yourself sitting at home? I sometimes sitting at home when I'm not involved in the investigation, but I'm watching a certain person on TV crying for their loved ones, and I'm thinking, is that?
Well, it's funny you mention that, because there have been a couple of cases where, just from memory, partners or husbands or what have you have appealed to the media to solve this horrible crime, what have you, and my wife's been sitting there and she said, what do you think? And I said, he did it. And she said, how can you be so callous? How can you?
Yeah.
And in those cases, whether it's just been luck or whatever, he did do it. He was subsequently charged, and that has happened a couple of times.
It's funny your wife should say, how can you be so callous in that? I think that's what, it does change you, and we know that the work that we do changes us, but you can make the hard calls. You can make the hard calls that the general public don't want to accept, and I've always found it hard when I'm charging a lady with murdering a child, because the public just don't want to accept a lady could murder her own child or whatever. But we see it time and time again.
Well, there's no doubt. It's very hard. And under the Westminster system, where we've got rules, regulations, how we can behave, what we can say and what we can do, it doesn't take into account your own intuition, your own experience. And that's what I think, again, with homicide, and I refer to homicide, but it applies throughout the detectives and the police force in general. You can pick up, and you do, unless you're not as fully committed as you should be, I think.
Yeah.
You can pick up, no, this is not right. There's something here, the manner, and it's an intuition, and there's no doubt about that. You can't use that as evidence, but you can certainly work around it.
That's the thing I think people sometimes misunderstand. As a detective, I can look at someone and think, I think you've done it, but that is so far removed from actually getting that person to court, and it's about gathering the evidence. And
yes. Look, it's there was one particular murder I did with Paul Mager, who was again in homicide for a number of years. We worked together very closely, and this particular job we went to, a woman had been murdered and a baby had been very badly injured, and still to this day. He thought he was pretty smart, and he concocted a story and what have you. Well, we worked on him for 2 days and let him tell us everything and what have you, and we were best mates.
Yep.
And he thought Paul and I were real good mates until we hit him with the hard questions.
Yeah.
And that nice, congenial guy just turned into a raving maniac.
Yeah.
He was subsequently convicted of that, and he's spent a number of years in jail for the murder of his partner and the attempted murder of his little baby, and a number of assaults that took place in the jail while he was in jail. So whenever he was coming out for parole, he couldn't help himself. There'd be a blue, and off he'd go again.
Yeah, and quite often people like that have got through their lives, and people haven't scratched the surface and seen what's under there.
People haven't picked it, and haven't. It was pretty obvious right from the. He certainly wasn't our best mate, but he tried to bluff his way through, and the more he spoke, the deeper he got. And by the time he realised it was too far gone, and he became very violent.
One of the cases that I mentioned at the start, and that I think you'd have to acknowledge it changed you, it changed policing to a degree, is the killer known as the granny killers.
I thought you'd bring this one up.
Yeah, well, it's one that I think, I honestly think that the skills of New South Wales Police were enhanced by what was learnt on that investigation. And just so the public are aware of what we're talking about, there was 6 elderly ladies murdered on the North Shore, Sydney. I think it was in 1990...
89, 90.
90. And it was over a 12-month period.
13 months.
13 months.
Precise, yeah.
6 elderly ladies found in the North Shore within a 5 or 10 kilometre radius, or even narrower?
Well, it was Mossman particularly in the first instances, but then it expanded to Lane Cove and Roseville.
It's something that Sydney hadn't seen before, or Australia hadn't seen before?
Well, we were in contact over a period of time with overseas police forces, Scotland Yard and the FBI, and it was a unique investigation that involved elderly women only, and the thing, that the uniqueness about it was that the murders were taking place as we were trying to identify and apprehend the offender, the person responsible. And as you know, the pressure was just enormous, the political pressure, and the pressure on the individuals. And that task force, as you said, Jubes, it set new parameters for major investigations. There were over 70 men and women on that task force at the end there. And it comes back to what I said at the start of this interview. I would venture to suggest that every one of those detectives was totally committed to the job that we were doing. We had detectives on call 24 hours, they were working 24 hours, but the murders were taking place, and the pressure that what were we doing wrong, what could we do better, how, and we were continually going back and revising our methods and what have you, and it did redefine major investigations. Some of them...
Can I just interrupt there, because you're talking about the pressure, and I think the public would understand pressure in that if you're being put in charge of a murder investigation, and it's pretty clear that you've got to find the person responsible. Where the granny killer situation was unique, and you've touched on it, is the fact that not only were you trying to solve one murder, but the longer you took to solve who was responsible for this, more people were going to die. And that was the reality of it, wasn't it?
That's what was taking place. And it was the brutality of each of those murders that really shocked hardened detectives, certainly shocked me. And it was, we've got to stop this. How do we stop it? What are we missing? What aren't we doing properly? And one thing that came out of it, which really jumped out, was that there was, on one occasion during, you have a canvass of an area. The canvass is where detectives go and interview, and police themselves go and interview people in that area for anything that they may have seen that may have been suspicious. That one word created more problems for us than anything else.
Seeing something suspicious?
Suspicious.
Yes, yeah.
Because all of a sudden, it wasn't just, what did you see? What did you see anything suspicious? Yeah. And the thing that jumped out from that on one occasion, there was probably some drug addict was seen jumping over some back fences in the vicinity and near the time of a murder, and an identikit was brought up in relation to that. Now, we weren't aware that one of the junior detectives was going to release that, but in any event, it was released. But that gave the impression to the general population that the murderer was a druggie or a criminal or a bikie or what have you, in their minds, subconsciously in their mind. So it wasn't what you saw, anything suspicious. And we were getting hundreds of calls.
That's interesting you say that, because like a double-edged sword when you make an appeal to the public, because the public identify, if there's a serial killer, the serial killer in their mind looks a certain way, acts a certain way, and it makes it easy for them if they can identify that person as a bad person. with the fact, the reality of the granny killer, and if we talk about that, the actual person, John Glover.
Lorraine Glover, yes.
Yeah.
Well, you had a woman on one of the murders who had bumped into a man who had to be the murderer. And she gave a description of the shoes, of the trousers, of the belt and the shirt that this well-dressed middle-aged man, the description she gave us at the time, when it came to time of Glover becoming a suspect, and we showed that witness a number of photos of Glover, no, not him, didn't identify him. And it was him.
Yeah.
And we actually found those clothes in his house, in his wardrobe, after he'd been arrested and the search warrants were executed and what have you. So it couldn't have been him because he was a well-dressed,
Yes.
elderly man.
Yeah, yeah.
She didn't pick him. If she'd have picked him, well, it's another
And
story.
that with that pressure, and I've worked on serial killings and other investigations where I feel the pressure, but I say, and I pay tribute to the people that worked on that were that core group working on that investigation, that it set the standard for how we operate as homicide detectives, and I really, that's the lineage that's passed on to this day, what we've learnt from that. But what were the dynamics like in the team? Like, everyone pointed in the same direction? Was there any conflict when you're talking about, is this person a suspect, another person a suspect? How did the dynamics work?
Oh, look, when you say conflict, there were minor, not conflicts, but everybody was asked to contribute. Every day you would have a debriefing of the preceding 24 hours, of what had taken place. We'd review whatever, and then ask, can anybody contribute? They made me, I bore the brunt of quite a few jokes for a long time, where I suggested...
No one, I can say in all honesty, I've never heard anyone make a joke about you, Miles.
Oh, that's true, yes, yes, no, they're very serious. I've never been known to smile when I'm working,
you're a cranky fella.
But I came up with the idea, well, could it be a woman, the murderer be a woman? And that stopped the conversation pretty smartly. And I said, well, hang on, we're looking at a blunt instrument, like a hammer or an axe or whatever.
Yeah.
It doesn't take a lot of force for a woman, especially a big woman, or a powerful woman. Who's to say we're looking for a man? Let's look for a woman.
Yeah.
Well, I copped that for a number of months. I won't go into that, but
it's interesting you say that, because on tough investigations you have got to think outside the square. I know if I'm running investigations, I ask for input, and sometimes when the pressure's on, I go, I don't care how crazy the idea is, give an idea.
Have a look.
And quite often in that group environment, someone will put their hand up and go, like you said, maybe it's a woman, and everyone will be laughing, but at least it invites them to start thinking that way.
Well, I copped it, and the part that hurt me, that my workmate at the time, Barry Keeling, he was
I've heard about Barry Keeling.
Yeah, well, he was the worst offender, and never let me forget that.
And that's the person that owns the place that we're sitting at right now?
Yes, he's my current employer.
You never liked him, did you?
And he's never liked me, to be honest. It just goes to show, when you say conflict, there wasn't conflict, but at least we were trying to come up with something. With such a serious, not trying to belittle it, murders are going to take place, and murders are a part and parcel of any detective. You're going to come across murders or what have you, and they're a fact of life. And unless you can sort of look at it in a constructive way and try and be constructive, you're not much good to anybody. You can't afford to get too emotionally involved in any of that. And that's what we tried to do during the grannies. There was just so much that was new, there was so much that was tried.
I call policing and detective work, it's a contact sport. You've got to be robust. Like, you raise that, and your mate Barry's bagging you about that, and he would have come up with an idea that I'm sure you didn't.
And you bounce off one another.
Yeah. And it's through that the actual, you point in the same direction. And I think that's the secret to an investigation, making sure, despite differences and different personalities, that we're all heading in the same direction. people will readily identify that, okay, the cops went and got on the piss and that. But you do need to release the pressure when you're under that type of pressure. What were the dynamics there? How did you release the pressure during that intense 13 months?
I think mine host Joe Sands up at the box, the Willoughby Hotel. We gathered there at the end of the day quite regularly before we headed home. And they weren't big drinking sessions, but just have a couple of beers and relax, and you'd have a driver, would get us home. Things happened so fast during that investigation, especially I can remember on one of the murders had taken place, we'd worked all day, all night, and part of the morning, or most of the morning, the boss, Mike Hagan, said, come on, you blokes, go home and you've got to get some sleep. You've been on too long, head off home. He organised a driver to take a couple of us home and said, would you like a beer? And I will never forget this moment when I ripped the top off a can of beer in our office when a phone call came in. We have another murder, we have another body, and at Belrose. And I just couldn't believe it. That was probably one of the lowest points. I just thought, oh no.
Just so the public understand, when you're talking about working day, night, evening, you've probably been awake for 24 hours?
Oh yes, yes, it was longer than that.
And what we're talking, I want to make this point because sometimes people say, oh, I've been up all night, but we're literally talking you've been up working for 24, 30 hours straight, and then you've got to go respond again.
I don't know. I think occupational health and safety and everything else these days, you wouldn't do it, and I do appreciate that. But again, I come back to the enthusiasm that the police involved in that were involved. That's what you do.
The adrenaline kicks back in, doesn't it? When you're that invested in it.
You go home, you can't sleep anyway. My wife often says that I was used to 2 hours sleep a night. That's all I needed. And that's probably true.
So with that one, you've been up all night, all day, and you've gone to it. What were you confronted with at the scene there?
Well, we went straight out to the scene. I might add, I didn't even take a mouthful of beer. It didn't even get to my lips. So we went out to the scene, and again, the commander, Mike Hagan, Superintendent Mike Hagan, said, no, you blokes have got to have a break, go home. So we were taken home. The initial stages were taken by other members of the task force, and then the following day we kicked off again, and the major team of the homicide squad, including Barry and Paul Mager, Murray Burns, we'd been in it right from the word go, and basically it was our baby, and we weren't about to give up. But
what was the gotcha moment in that investigation? When did you think that you're onto it? Because I know in every investigation I do that at some point in time I go, fuck, we've got this person now.
The gotcha moment, I'd have to say, Juice, was I walked into the office one morning, 7 o'clock in the morning, and Detective Paul Tuxford, who'd been working with us for a number of months on it, and he said, Miles, he said, I've got your murderer. I said, what? He said, I've got your murderer. I said, okay, Taxi, who's the murderer? He said, I don't know who he is, but I've got your murderer. I think I swore a couple of times and said, well, if you can't tell me who it is, what are you raving about? But then when we sat down and he identified a elderly grey-haired man that had been appearing, not only a number of murders that had taken place, but through the investigation that had widened into assaults and sexual assaults on elderly women over a period of 2 years, came up with a suspect, grey-haired elderly man, well-dressed. Most of those offences hadn't even been reported to the police.
Right.
They had been uncovered when police had gone to nursing homes, retirement villages and what have you, and the employees, the personnel there, said, oh, no, we didn't report it to the police, but there was an incident 9 months ago that took place, and built a picture, and Tuxie was working on that. After sitting down with him, obviously there was a hurried conference and what have you, and then we identified him and went from there.
Right. And the arrest, the time. And I know that's fairly dramatic. Are you happy to talk through that?
Well, I'm not real happy, I've got to tell you, because you're reliving it. I've tried to forget it for so bloody long. Yes, that was, it's something that you'll never get over, a moment like that where we'd actually had the surveillance unit following him 24 hours a day, followed him that morning to the house. He entered the house, he was obviously well known to the occupant of the house who met him at the front
just
door.
so the public understand, because we talk a little bit cop talk here, but we've got the suspect, we've identified the suspect, and it's a person by the name of John Glover.
Yes.
And he was a
Pie salesman.
Pie salesman that would frequent retirement villages and other businesses
yes,
round
in
the
the
North
line
Shore.
of his business, yes.
And so the police, now that with all the things lining up, we're looking at that this is a suspect, so surveillance starts following his movements.
Yes.
You've followed him to a place.
Yeah, I jumped in a bit there,
That,
yes. Well, all of the victims had been approached in the street,
Yep.
all about 4 o'clock. Quite bizarre, really, but around about 4 o'clock was the bewitching hour, and they'd been attacked from behind.
Yep.
Not only was a vicious, evil murderer, he was a coward. And on this occasion, he went to a bottle shop. He rang his work. We had a listening device on his phone too, which you'd be interested in. And
We don't need cheap shots, Miles. It doesn't make you a better person. And I pleaded not guilty.
Yeah, I've seen all this before. They all,
I'm
plead
innocent.
not guilty. Yes, and so we knew he was taking the day off work to see his solicitor. Allegedly, that was his excuse. He went to a bottle shop, purchased a bottle of whiskey, and then went to a house again at Mossman. He approached the house. The front door was open, and he was greeted with a peck on the cheek by a woman who answered the door, who incidentally was in her petticoats, so she obviously was very well acquainted with him. And he entered the house, and we sat from the house with the observation squad. We were further away for a number of hours until it started to get dark, and concerns were raised of what was going on.
Okay, and again, put it in perspective, because when you're telling it, I'm getting chills just looking at it from a policing point of view, the situation that you find yourself in. So you've got a suspect, or what I would call a red hot suspect. You got him under surveillance, and he's gone into a house, and you're sitting there making a call. What do we do? Do we knock on the door? Well, yeah.
It was a question that it was getting more desperate as the hours went by, and there was a dog inside the house, and the dog was barking. So we made a decision to call the local uniform police down and ask them, or they didn't know it was us calling. We made a call saying, we live at such and such a street in Mossman. There's a woman there living by herself. The dog's barking inside. It's a bit unusual. Could you check it out?
Yeah, just from a policing point of view, I think that's a creative way of having a look inside.
Well, that was just the best we could think of at the time.
Yeah.
We had the surveillance unit police in the grounds of the house, so if anything had taken place, we just said no need to enter the place at all.
Yep.
Just knock on the door and see, who answers the door. The police went to the front door, no answer. Went to the back door, no answer, and then we called them off.
Yeah.
We were there within 30 seconds.
Yep.
Said thank you, we'll take over. Please just stand back.
Yep.
We went in through the back door. The place was in darkness. Unfortunately, sounds very blasé, but there was another victim lying in the hallway, exactly the same as all of the others, where not only had the victim been attacked, she'd been defiled by clothing being removed and what have you. There was a hammer lying on the floor next to her, which was pretty horrific. And we went through the house, which was all in darkness, fully expecting the suspect that we knew was in there. Was he sitting there with a shotgun?
Yeah.
Was he sitting there? So we were armed. We went from room to room, checked each room, calling to each other. went to the bathroom, and he was in the bath. It was a full bath. The bath was actually overflowing the water, and his nose was just above the waterline, so he was still breathing.
This is John Glover.
This was John Wayne Glover, and there was the empty bottle of scotch by the side of the bath, and of course at that stage I grabbed him, I took hold of his hair and gently raised his head from the bath. He would not agree with that description, but in any event, pulled him from the bath, and he was still breathing. We called the paramedics.
Yep.
They attended. We called for the cavalry to come, and next thing the place was swarming and what have you. We had to save him. We wanted to talk to him. He was still alive, and that was the rest of that night. To me, is a total blur.
I can imagine.
They took him to the Royal North Shore Hospital under a very, very heavy police guard. Murray Burns and Paul Jacob went with him in the ambulance and held his hand. And Paul Mager and I were out the back at 2:30 in the morning, and we were standing out the back, and it's a situation I will never forget. Somebody had brought us cold hamburgers, and we had a cold cup of coffee each. And I looked out at the sky, I looked at the scientific, the forensic were all going through the house. Paul and I are just out the back, and I looked around at Paul. We'd been working on this for 13 months, and it ended up, I said, this is how it's ended up. I said, can you believe this, Paul?
Yeah.
You know, what are we doing here? And I'll never forget, Paul looked at me, a couple of seconds. He said, you're right. He said, Miles, wouldn't miss it for quids. And mate, that summed it up. That really summed it up.
I can imagine. I can imagine Paul.
We both
saying,
burst out laughing.
Saying that. And
you know?
what the public probably don't understand with the type of pressure that comes with a job like that and a finish like that. And I'm sure you get asked. I get asked quite a lot. How do you deal with the pressure of it and all that? It's through those little moments of you've just got to release it, and
it's got to be
not laugh at the situation, but laugh at yourself being in the situation you're in, because it seems surreal, doesn't it?
Yeah, it's not as if we're trying to downplay the horrendous nature of that investigation. I mean, it affected so many people, and of course we're very much aware, as you know, we believe that Glover committed more murders prior to that, but...
and you've said, and just before we move on past it, you talked about the impact it had on you in the time that was away from your family, or you're away from your family, and it's virtually 13 months that you just disappear. But also that you said to me that you kept visiting Glover even after you retired from the police.
Yeah, dopey me, yes.
I don't think you've been a dummy by going, and that's what a committed detective should do. And I think that sometimes the public don't understand just how committed you are, or detectives are in general. Police, not just detectives, but police. But the fact that you've left the cops and you still take time to go see this murdering scumbag with the view of maybe, just maybe, he's sitting on more secrets than you might be able to bring closure.
Don't build me up too much, mate.
You're just going to have to cop this, Miles.
Look, if I'm fair dinkum, I'd reckon ego come into it too. I didn't want a bastard to beat me, you know.
I understand that, because it is, you don't want them to get away with things.
There's so many instances there where Ronnie Woodens, the Commissioner of Corrective Services, Ron was terrific in supporting me there. I'd just ring Ron and he'd say, you go whenever you want to, after I'd retired, of course.
Yeah.
And Ron would say, why do you bother? You know? And, I said, well, I don't want him to beat me. He knows I know, and he plays his silly little games and what have you. And I'd spoken to Dr. Rod Milton, and Rod was really great. I said, I don't know whether I'm asking...
Dr. Rod Milton is a forensic psychiatrist.
Yep. And put a lot of faith in Rod, and all Rod would say to me was, look, he's talking to you. While he's talking, keep him talking. I said, well, what should I ask him? He said, well, that's your call. We'd every time I'd try and tie him down, he'd change the subject
Yeah.
or what have you. And but there's no doubt that he enjoyed it, his little games.
Yeah.
And he'd say things like, "Look, you know, with all the psychology and psychoanalysis and all that sort of stuff, there is a dark part of my mind there." And he said, "You know that." And he said, "If at any time it might unlock," he said, "if I find the key to unlock it," he said, "grab a pencil and paper and come here running."
That's what Glover...
Right? He said that.
That's chilling.
Oh, yes,
Yeah,
he said
yeah,
that to me. And that was, I said, "John, just come out and tell me."
Yeah.
And he'd come back and say, "Well, you just want to create a name for yourself. You just want to clean up the outstanding murders. You want to blame me for all these outstanding murders."
Yeah.
I think it comes back, when we're talking about these Times tubes, where I talk about the night that we actually arrested him, it comes back to, went out to the Long Bay before the trial, and I was with Paul Jacob.
Yeah.
And I said, "John, we went through all the normal rigmarole and what have you before the trial, and I said, there's a number of other matters I want to speak to you about, some outstanding murders." And he said, "Which ones?" And it just took me back. It's not, "What are you trying to do?" I didn't do any. He said, "Which ones?"
Yeah, that's pretty telling, isn't it? Like I got that the moment you said that.
And I said, "Geez, I'll have a cup of tea or something here. How do I approach this?"
Yeah.
But that was right from the word go. And he played his silly games.
Yeah.
And
it's I know when you're speaking to, and I say pure evil, and I'm not saying that lightly, because when we're talking about him, that is pure evil. But do you come away sometimes with exchanges like that, feeling drained, feeling dirty, and you want to go home and just wash your hands and just that dark side that you've got to take yourself into?
A number of times I came out physically and mentally drained. After I retired, of course, this is not during the thing, but it happened then. But after I'd retired, and a couple of times I went there by myself, and leave the jail out there at Lithgow, went out to the car park, and I'd just sit in the car park for 15, 20 minutes trying to... deep breathing and what have you, and thinking, "You bastard,"
Well, that's the psychology of it. To get into their minds, you've got to let them into your world, and that's what when I walk away from that, that's where I feel drained. I feel like shit. I've just let this pure evil, get inside me.
You've got me going now. There was one occasion I took a little bit longer. I was by myself, and I was interviewing him in a room, and there was a prison officer outside the room, and was sitting opposite each other at a table, and he used to play his games because I'd never turned my back on him, and he knew that. And he actually shadow boxed around me.
You're not stupid. That's probably sensible.
Even though he didn't have a weapon, but on this particular occasion he was sitting opposite me, and I was talking about his family. And I could see the redness coming up in him. I could see the veins in his neck going. And I thought, I'll keep going on this. And I touched on his daughters, and he exploded. In an instant, he smashed his hand down on the table, jumped up, and the table went up because he was sitting underneath it. The prison officer raced inside. I'm sitting there, and Glover walked to the corner of the room, and he stood there, sort of composed himself a bit. I said to the prison bloke, "It's okay, and I'm like this." And he sat back, and I just pretended to be very nonchalant about the whole thing as if it didn't take place. And within a matter of minutes, he'd calmed down, and he just spoke about a totally other subject. Out of the blue, nothing. And what hit me there was that's what he probably would have been like when he committed the murders. An explosion of rage where, a pretty powerfully built man with a hammer from behind, the damage that he did, and it all came flashing back. I went out into the car park and just sat there, and I was still shaking like a leaf.
I can imagine it. And you can't show that fear or whatever. So you walk out, sit in your car.
I was good as gold, There were another occasion where he'd had he'd had a breast removed
Yeah.
with cancer.
Right.
And it really played on his mind, and I used to play up to that for a while. He thought only women could get breast cancer.
Oh, that's
and,
the interesting psychology.
and it really upset
Yeah,
him. And quite a number of times he spoke with that. And this particular time he'd been in hospital with another tumour in his stomach or what have you. And he walked into the room and the door was closed behind him, only he and I in the room. He took off his shirt, prison greens,
Yeah, yeah.
showed me the scar on his breast and the scar on his stomach that he'd recently had at the hospital.
Yeah,
And he's just there in his Reg Grundies,
Yeah.
standing in front of me.
yeah,
And I looked at him and I said, geez, you've trimmed down a bit, John. You've lost a fair bit of beef
Yeah,
there, mate,
yeah.
you know. And he stood there, like this. I said, I may as well go home. I said, I'm used to fighting heavyweights here. I said,
Yeah.
I'm not going to muck around with a bantamweight
Yeah,
like
yeah,
you, you know.
yeah.
He just jumped around then in his
Yeah,
underpants,
yeah.
shadow boxing around me.
Really? Yeah, yeah.
And again, I sat there thinking, what in the bloody hell am I doing here? You know.
But I see what I love about what you're saying is that's the psychology that you've got to get into people's minds.
Well, I
And-
tried, but I didn't succeed.
But you find the weakness, you probe around, I think, as a detective to go, okay, and so you're getting reactions from him. So I think you're doing your job.
Well, I went along Rod's advice,
Yeah,
Rod
yeah,
Milton, the
yeah.
psychiatrist. And the irony of the whole of this, the culmination of this over a period of years, I truly believed he was ready to admit 3 murders. I honestly believe that.
And you mentioned that to me a while back, that you feel bad that you were just so close and you just missed it.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and through him trying to be
Yeah.
a smarty and doing what he did, I
right.
firmly believe he didn't
Yeah.
mean to commit suicide. But,
Yeah.
anyway.
With your time speaking with Glover, did you get an insight into what the motives were? Did he ever give you, with all the time that you've spoken to him, did he ever reveal that to you?
No, but I've got no doubt, again in my mind, there's not a shred of doubt, he had a hatred for elderly women.
Yeah, yeah,
He, and I'm sure that stemmed from going back to his younger days when he found some photographs of his mother during the war where she was in a state of undress,
right.
and found out that she'd had a number of affairs and what have you. Bearing in mind it was
Yeah.
during the war,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
that was quite common,
Yeah,
I would
yeah.
assume. But from his family, they said that did have an impact on him.
That was the anger.
And but his defence, of course, was that this only happened once his mother and mother-in-law passed away, and something snapped.
Right.
Diminished responsibility.
Yeah,
It wasn't
yeah.
him; it was somebody else doing
Yeah,
it.
yeah.
And of course, if you went to murders before
Yeah.
his mother-in-law
Yeah.
passed away, his defence is blown.
Yeah, yeah.
So
yeah.
he wanted to maintain that.
Right,
And of course,
right.
all he said to me was, you want to clear them all up, you want to blow them
Yeah.
in for everything. But every single one of those assaults was on elderly women.
Did you have, you talked about other crimes and when he said
Yes.
which murders, and that's
Yes.
like a waving a
Oh.
red flag to a detective, like,
Yes,
oh, there's
that's
others.
right.
Okay. Did you have any in mind?
Oh, yes.
Did you, which
Yes, we had.
ones?
Well, there were 3 murders on the Central Coast,
Yep.
3 elderly women in...
In the North Shore of Sydney, the Central Coast is an hour and a half.
we're talking about the peninsula, the Woy Yamina.
Right, okay, about an hour and a half north of Sydney.
Ettalong and Yamina.
Yeah, yeah.
And he was the pie salesman in
Yeah.
the Central Coast area, in that area, during that period.
Yeah.
But unfortunately, there is not a shred of doubt he did them. And another one in Sydney. I
Yeah.
stand corrected there. 2 on the Central Coast and 1 in Sydney. He was the sales representative for a 2-year period where those murders took place. And both women had been to a local club
Right.
down at Ettalong.
Yeah.
And as it turned out, the secretary manager of the club was an ex-policeman that I knew, and rang him and I said, can we have your records for 77,
Yeah.
79? He said, yes, yeah. He said, we've got them all downstairs in the basement. I said, you beauty. Get them, we'll be straight
Yeah.
down to see you. Before I'd left the office, he rang back and said, you're not going to believe this, Miles.
Yeah.
He said 6 weeks ago, we had a flood.
Yeah.
The basement was flooded. All the records were flooded. They were all destroyed. They went to the tip. and they're under about 20 tonne of topsoil.
Jesus, you would have taken that well.
I would have dug it myself if,
Yeah.
we had a chance.
Yeah,
He said they're all waterlogged, they're all destroyed,
Yeah.
even if you find
Yeah.
something. So if we'd have been able to put him on a date on the Central Coast
Yeah.
for those two murders, he would have been charged.
What's your thoughts, given that the age? How old was he at the time of committing these offences?
57, I think.
Okay,
Kilo, 57, was he?
57. So, what precipitated that? Was there other crimes that you think he did
Yes.
earlier?
Oh, yes, yeah.
And was there a
again,
build-up? Like the classic thought is it start off
He's
here
a
and
classic.
then... Yeah,
And that's the part that he used to take offence to every time that you would raise it.
yeah.
John,
Textbook serial killer.
your textbook.
Yeah,
You are
yeah.
textbook. And I was asking him about Ivan Milat,
Yeah,
another great sort of guy.
Yeah, yeah.
You know, what a guy. And said, in particular, we wanted to know whether there were one or two offenders in that.
yeah,
And on a number of occasions, when I first approached him, I said,
Yeah.
John, these are the circumstances that we know of the Belanglo State Forest murders, blah, 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 the weapons used, the manner of the bodies and what. And he said, why would you ask me? I said, you're classic textbook.
He doesn't see himself as...
Oh, no.
Yeah.
No,
Yeah.
you know, he'd shake
That's
his head.
interesting.
You're kidding. No, not me. Blah, blah.
Yeah.
Well, this happened on two occasions. The first time, where he said, no,
Yeah.
he got very
Yeah.
offended
Yeah,
to be accused of being a serial murderer.
You'd even link him to Ivan Milat.
Look, you know, how could you think of the two
Yeah.
of us in the same breath?
Yeah.
And the second time I went there and said, John, look at it this way. You used to be top dog with serial murders. I said, now you're falling behind Ivan.
Yeah.
He's in front of you now. I'm not being blasé about murders. We're talking about horrific events. But he spoke of murders as if he was going and buying a pie down the shop.
So, well, and on that's where, like, as a detective, you're looking for an angle. And that angle was that he sat as top dog because
Yeah,
he'd
well,
murdered
they
6 people.
tried that. Just
Ivan had murdered 7.
Yeah,
and,
that's right.
okay, well, let's dangle the carrot at him. Do you want to be the top? Yeah,
we
good
tried
tactics.
that.
I like that. I like that.
Well, he didn't. And said to him about, again, this was the second occasion, and I said, you can't help us? He said, no. I said, do you think he did it by himself? And he said, how would I know? How would I know? And carrying on like this. Okay, we went to whatever subjects we went to, normally for an hour and a half, 2 hours, I suppose I spoke to him for. And on this occasion, the second time I asked him, we'd spoken about it in the early part of our interview, but we'd gone on to other subjects and talked about the weather, football, anything. And he got up, he went to the door, he opened the door, the prison officer opened it for him. He went to go out and he turned around to me and he just held up 2 fingers, turned around and walked out.
Really?
And then wouldn't talk about it again.
Yeah.
In other words, there were 2.
The pure evil of Glover is just plain frightening. I know the investigation took a toll on all those involved, and full credit to them for bringing him to justice. That's just part 1 of Dennis's podcast. This Sunday, part 2 has been released. I will be talking to Dennis about his international manhunt to catch the killers of heart surgeon Victor Chang and a sad case involving the famous Waters boxing family. See you then. I Catch Killers is published by True Crime Australia, produced by Claire Harvey from the Sunday Telegraph and Dylan Adams at Made in Katana. I'm now an investigative journalist at News Corp Australia, attached to the Sunday Telegraph. If you like the podcast, please subscribe to our newspapers.